Good evening and welcome to The Right Side. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this is the show where we talk about today's news, views, and trends from an admittedly conservative perspective. This evening, I'm joined by a guest that many of you may know by name and face, someone who's done their time in Washington, D.C. and lived to tell about it, Senator Jim DeMint. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be with you.
So, for those of the people in our audience who don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in this whole politics thing.
Yeah, I tell people once I was normal, and now I'm a recovering politician, but I was a normal person, a business guy, had 4 children, very involved in my community back in Greenville, South Carolina. But I got tired of pounding on the television set, asking why they keep doing these things that make life worse for people rather than better. And I thought, since I was a business consultant, a strategy person, that I could go and make a difference in Washington. So I threw my name in the hat, ran for Congress, and surprised me and a lot of other people, but I ended up winning, and I went to the House.
And you spent 3 terms in the House. Tell us why only 3?
Well, I said when I ran for office, I didn't want to be a career politician. I wanted to be really a statesman, and I said I wouldn't serve more than 6 years. And after that, I'd either run for something else or go back home and go back to my business. And that's what I did. I decided after being in the House that the Senate was the real problem, and signed up to run. And it was another uphill battle. I didn't expect necessarily to win, but I spent 8 years in the Senate. I left earlier this year because I just sensed the time was urgent and believed I could do more outside of the Senate than inside.
So you confirmed that Senate was the problem?
It definitely is the problem, and getting worse, I'm afraid.
So talk to us, for those of us who haven't been lucky enough to get inside those walls, what was most surprising for you as you entered those hollowed halls?
Well, for a practical person who'd been in business like myself, I was just amazed at how irrational a lot of the decision making was, and how unimportant things like having a budget, balancing the budget, things you have to do with your own checkbook and certainly with a business. And you were dealing with other people's money, and people behaved a lot differently. I thought everyone would want to work on common sense things like cutting spending, balancing the budget, fixing Social Security and Medicare for the future, but it was all about what the lobbyists wanted. It was about what the big constituents back home wanted, the campaign contributors. And I tell people once early in a Republican meeting, they were talking about why we needed to vote for something that we all knew was a bad bill, and going back and forth about that. And I just stood up and said, this is completely irrational. Now, I was a freshman, and I wasn't supposed to stand up without being recognized, but I stood up and blurted it out. The whole room got quiet. All the leadership up front was giving me the evil eye. And then someone yelled out, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." I never knew who that person was, but everyone laughed. I sat down, they forgot it, but I never got used to it.
And so how much of an influence do the lobbyists have? And the citizenry is more and more often under the belief that these folks are bought off, so common sense will never prevail. Is that really true?
Well, the lobbyists are good people. They just are representing a particular cause. And most of the people who come in your office, whether you're a congressman or a senator, want something from government. That's why earmarks were so popular. You could get an earmark for your state, and the highway contractors like that, the property owners like that. Hardly ever does anyone come through your office and say, let's cut this program, let's cut this spending. Because everyone kind of works together. I won't gore your ox if you won't gore mine. So let's roll up all this spending into one bill, get what you want, Democrats, Republicans. That's how we got $17 trillion in debt. It's easy to have bipartisanship when you're spending money. The problem comes is when you talk about how can we cut things? How can we eliminate these programs we know are wasteful? You can't get agreement on that, and that's the real problem right now. We are at the edge of a cliff, and we can't get people to cut it off.
And so, is there a solution? If we know that everyone is going to turn the blind eye because they don't want to lose their own bacon for their districts or their constituents or their owners, I mean lobbyists.
Yeah.
Is there a solution, or do we just have to take the alcoholic route and just hit rock bottom before people realize?
I hope we don't get to that point, but that's an option we need to consider. What happens if we do hit bottom? But the real missing player in Washington has been the people. This is a government of and for and by the people. I mean, it's all about we the people, but the people themselves have not been present in Washington. They're represented through maybe the association their business is a part of, but generally today, big government is in bed with big corporation, big banks, big government unions. The little guys are getting left out. Despite what anyone in Washington tells you, big government does not help the little guy. The Wall Street wrote the big Dodd-Frank. It was not for the little guy. It'll put the little guy out of business. So what we need to do, and the reason I left the Senate to go to Heritage, is we need to get Americans more informed, more engaged, more involved with the process, because I've seen that if you can get people involved, change who's in Washington, change out of Washington. That's why Heritage Foundation.
And we appreciate you making that move. Obviously, people don't always understand what Heritage is, and so I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes explaining what Heritage is, as well as some of the initiatives that you're working on, and then we'll get into a little bit more of application of those principles.
Well, Heritage has been around 40 years, and actually it was reading a lot of their papers that got me interested in politics in the first place. I started to see the connection between what I cared about in the real world and public policy. And that's when I realized I was a conservative. I'd never called myself a conservative, but I was reading how limited government helps the private sector grow faster, creates more opportunities. So they've got good research to back up what they're talking about. What I've found is that the liberals or the progressives are always talking about theory, and very seldom do they have any real policy. They just say, you've got a problem, we'll help you. Or you need health care, let's have a government health care plan. Heritage builds on the successes of the future. What has worked in the past? How do you build on it and make it better? And actually, success comes from making sure you're connected with those factors in the past that have built this great country. Heritage does that, and when I was in the House of Representatives, Heritage staff helped me with a lot of policy innovation, personal accounts for Social Security, new types of tax reform ideas. Their staff was like my staff, and the same thing in the Senate. And in the Senate, when we were trying to stop treaties through the United Nations, which I knew were bad, I could get their experts to come testify in front of my committee. And now with their sister organization, Heritage Action, they have people organized all over the country that actually call and email their congressmen and senators and say, don't you vote for that UN treaty. And now a lot of people in Washington know that their voters are watching what they're doing. There are a lot of pretend votes in Washington where they pretend to be for something when what they talk about is, okay, how can they make it look like they're for it when they're really against it, or vice versa. Heritage Action is starting to help voters actually know what they're really doing in Washington. So Heritage Action is pretty unpopular with congressmen and senators right now, and generally that's a good thing.
Yeah, anytime you can be effective enough to tick people off or to make them concerned that you're around, and if they begin to demonize you, that actually usually means you're winning.
Yeah, if they like you in Washington, you're probably part of the problem.
For sure. So tell us some of the things that Heritage is helping to educate people about, because it is important. An informed electorate can make huge changes, and the politicians are often not used to an informed electorate showing up.
Well, what we're trying to connect with real people, not just talk about our research or our policies, but understanding that people perceive things differently. And if you put a conservative label on an idea, there are a lot of folks in California who would think it was a bad idea before they listen to it. So we've got to set aside the labels and talk to people about how we can make their life better. Mm-hmm. And there are really three areas, if you look at public policy, that can make your life better. One is just a good economy, where you can have prosperity, opportunity, jobs, financial security. So economic policies are really important. The other part is a strong culture. Now, that may sound old-fashioned, but the people closest to you, your family, your friends, the folks you go to church with, you work with in your community, those are the most important people to making your life better. If you have a bad community around you, it's hard to get out of it. Some people do, but a strong culture is important to a better life. The third component is just a strong country, a strong defense to know that people cannot attack us, they cannot take advantage of or take our interest around the world. So those three factors are important, and Heritage has a whole array of policies that support those. But we found if we talk about the policies first, people don't know why that's relevant to them. So we have to help people see this in the ways they value. What's important to your life, your children, your job, the things you like to have fun doing. So at Heritage, we're working on the in-depth policies on all three of those areas. But more and more, we're trying to figure out through better and better communication and communication research, how can we connect with people where they really live? And we're starting to do that, and we're starting to see some good results.
Well, and I actually have run into one of the people here locally that writes, I believe, for some of the Heritage publications in Spanish, as an example. So you are trying to reach out even to audiences that aren't traditionally considered within the sweet spot of the conservative or Republican side of things. How is that going, and how do you do that differently? Is there more than just language that you're addressing?
Well, you have to show up. I mean, you can't do this from Washington and say, okay, we're going to reach out to Hispanics. I've found that a lot of folks that have been told the wrong things about what conservatism means or what a Republican stands for. And if you show up and people see you're a real person and you start talking about what really affects their life, you realize you agree on a lot of things.
Absolutely.
And so this perception of the political labels are a huge problem. So we have to show up, be involved in the community. It's not just a matter of reaching out and packaging things in better words. It's getting involved with people's lives and helping them understand we care about them. And we can do that, but you can't do it as a politician as well as you can just a friend or a neighbor.
And so how does Heritage meet people where they live?
Well, we have people all over the country as part of our network and people who work for Heritage. Heritage Action, which is a sister organization, is actually doing more to actually organize in communities, to pull people together, to talk about ideas, to help them understand how their government works, how they can get involved if they want to. And people do this on a community level. If you can't make it fun, if you can't make it about friends, most people don't want to be involved with it because frankly, most people see politics as very, very negative, and that's not what they get up in the morning and look forward to doing.
Right. And more people, the fastest growing party identification is independent or people who have just had enough of both of the major parties and just...
The battle is for the ideas, and that's what we want to do at Heritage. We want to convince people of the ideas that are going to make their life better and show them how these ideas have worked in the past and how we can build on them. Conservatism is not being bound to the past, it's building on the successes of the past and making sure we're plugged into those things that are going to make things work better in the future. And we can do that in all areas. We see people who used to be opposed to more choices in education are now seeing, particularly those whose children actually got a different choice, it's not a Republican or Democrat issue, it's my issue if I get to pick a better school. And so you've had folks who used to say they were liberal are now looking at things differently because their children perhaps got in a better school, or they have family members who got a job in the energy business because of fracking, and they thought that conservative idea was bad for the environment. But when they found out natural gas is actually better for the environment. So if we can dispel a lot of the myths and misconceptions and just talk about what really affects people's lives, I'm convinced 80% of Americans agree with me. They may not want to be a Republican, they may not want to call themselves a conservative, but if we can approach it from the ideas that make their life better, I think we've got a lot of unity in America right now.
I found the same thing. When I was out on the campaign trail running for Congress, a similar thing. I ran as an independent, and what I found is 80% of the time, people agreed.
Yeah.
But if they smelt Republicanism in California, they would run like high rate of speed as far away as they could, but they agreed on the issues. So if Heritage were able to just focus on 3 initiatives that could potentially change the country for the better, what are the top 3 that you see being able to make an impact?
Well, the pro-growth economic policies is something we really need to focus on, and it's something that unites America. If they stop and listen, I mean, they've been told a lot. Obamacare was going to create jobs, you keep your insurance. More and more people are starting to say, wait a minute, these folks hadn't been telling me the truth. And we know and we can prove that less taxes and more money in the private economy is going to more likely create a job for you and other people than if you take it to Washington or to some state government. The pro-growth economic policies is something we're pushing a lot at Heritage, and that's something we really want people to understand. We also want them to understand that a good economy is based on good culture and skills and families. We don't want the federal government to define that for anyone and to focus on social policies. In fact, most of the ideas that I support as a conservative, concern for unborn human life, for instance, or protecting concepts of traditional marriage. Those decisions need to be made at the state and churches with individuals. That's not the kind of thing we need to be doing in Washington, D.C., because the Constitution limits what we're supposed to do there. The other thing is if the federal government, its primary function is to protect and defend the country and our interests. So defense is an area we spend a lot of time working with other countries all over the world. On any given day, we've got people from all over the world who come into Heritage to ask us to work with them on policies that can make their country better and to make our country more responsive to the needs of the world. So we're a pretty big player internationally.
And so talk to me about the practical application of some of these policies, because obviously we can talk policy and theory and everything else, but how does this translate to real life and legislation that, or situations that may be working themselves through Washington currently?
Well, let's talk about education, because that eventually affects all of us, as ourselves, as parents, as grandparents, communities, and it really has a lot to do with our country long term. And we've shown that we can equalize things through a public education system that makes education available to everyone. Unfortunately, government-run education, particularly at the federal level, has made education worse. So a lot of folks don't even know that the federal government wasn't really involved in education until the 1970s. There wasn't even a Department of Education until Jimmy Carter. And America had the best schools in the world. It wasn't an even quality around the country, but there was competition between the states. And while that doesn't create perfection, it's nice to have one state trying to copy things in another state that are working, and you tend to have states improving by copying each other. But the federal government create a standard. Standards sound good unless they lock you in at a lower level. And the federal government never funded but about 10% of public education, but they control most of how it's done. And I've had public school districts as clients, and once they take all the federal programs that they need to do in order to get the federal money, there's very little else that they can do to actually create the programs that their community needs. So one of the issues that unites people is to decentralize public education, move it out of Washington, give states lots of flexibility in how they do things. Similar to charter schools at the local level, they have the same standards, they just can do it in a different way. Let states take that back over in local communities. Instead of what we're seeing now, they have this idea now called Common Core, which,
if you say those words together, you get a lot of people's ire up.
Well, they should, because this was another federal program where they put out a cover sheet that said it does this and that, all this money, it's all voluntary. But now the rules come out and you realize that unless you're teaching this curriculum locally, you're not going to be able to meet the standards or get the money long term. And there's not going to be any money long term from Washington, so don't build a program around it. But this is another false promise, and we're trying to fight now with a lot of states who've accepted this to look at the whole program, and many of them are calling a timeout or getting out of this. It's not going to help education.
And many of the programs don't. So how do we stop people from lining up at the government trough if they're driven by this perception that they need money to improve everything, even though when they throw more money at it, the results don't improve?
And it's been a problem because a lot of states have fallen for this. Okay, here's a new program, here's a lot of money. So the states, what do we've got to lose? But what they've done in education and transportation and energy and health care is they've gotten pulled into all of these programs, and now the education is the #1 budget item for most communities and states. You look at health care through the Medicaid program, a lot of states are close to being bankrupted by all of this. And so I call it fool's gold. When states take money from the federal government with the strings come later, what we need is more bold states, and we're starting to see them. 26 states filed suit against Obamacare. A lot of states turned down the exchanges. A lot of states turning down Common Core. If we can get states to push back against the federal government, to say, we've had enough, we've seen how you do things, it's time to bring this back home. If we do that, we can save our country and keep our country from hitting the bottom, as we talked about at the beginning. But if states keep playing along, it's almost impossible to stop Washington if you have the states and the federal politicians pushing for bigger government.
And so if people are looking for ways to educate their elected officials, where should, obviously, you want them to visit the Heritage website, which is?
Heritage.org.
And so what kind of content can the folks access to make sure that their electeds are properly educated?
Well, almost any subject you can research on the website, and we have several products like Morning Bell or the Foundry. If people want to read things that consistently to find out more about this. And of course, through heritageaction.com, if they want to get more involved and learn how to write editorials, learn how to actually contact congressmen and senators, that's what they do on their side. Heritage Foundation doesn't lobby. We're more about education, research, informing people, and getting them engaged in what's happening to them. And we have decided to take a more aggressive stand than we have in the past. It's one of the reasons that I came to Heritage. I don't think there's a lot of time to keep doing what they've been doing in Washington. We have got to turn things around. Part of it is getting the states to push back. And I'm not giving up on any state. Folks say California's liberal, we shouldn't waste your time there. We've got a lot of conservative folks in California. Some of them would be afraid to say they were conservative.
Oh, yeah, I've met them. We have code winks.
Yeah, there are a lot of closet conservatives here, and people in California support groups like the Heritage Foundation to help us do work around the country. But also, California could be one of the first states to actually hit the wall, to run out of money. They can't fund their pension plans. And when that happens, everyone's going to be looking around for the ideas that work. And we want to make sure that we've got states all over the country setting the example on how to do taxes, how to do regulation, how to do education and health care. And if we can do that, then even the states that seem the most liberal could be our leaders in the next 5 years.
Yeah. We have to just talk to people as humans and meet them where they are, right?
That's exactly right.
So once again, the websites to contact or find out more?
Heritage.org and for our sister organization, heritageaction.com. And this is the 1-2 punch of informing people, but also getting them engaged.
Ideas without execution.
That's right.
Are relatively useless. So
That's
thanks
right.
for pulling it all together.
Chris, thank you.
And if you hold on for just a moment, Jim, we'll be right back after a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. And although we appreciate tremendously them making sure that this show can go on and that the crew is fed and everything else, what they're best known for is their speaker series. And the speaker series was the reason we were blessed this evening to be able to have Jim DeMint with us here in the studio, because he's off in a few minutes to go speak at the forum. And it's a special night because it's also the 10th anniversary of the Conservative Forum. Yes, there have been conservatives in the Bay Area for at least 10 years that we can justify and prove the existence of. But in upcoming months, we have, for example, December 3rd, Michael Ramirez, who's a senior editor and an editorial cartoonist for Investors Business Daily. In January, Evan Sayet, author and political satirist. February 14th, Valentine's Day, Victor Davis Hanson, that you can celebrate with someone you love by coming to the forum. In March, Greg Lukyanov, and then we've got people coming just scheduled through next year. But in May, a popular but controversial speaker, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, will be joining us at the forum. If you'd like more information on the forum and the events that are happening, you can go to theconservativeforum.com. And if you'd like to join us in person, the events happen at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Stearland Road, just about 3 minutes from here. But in closing, I just wanted to let you know that there's plenty of resources available at Heritage. There's even a mobile app that I have that pops up on my phone that will keep you continuously educated about the things that are happening in the country or policies that might be considered, which can really bring the country, and applied at the state level, the state back from the brink in many cases. As Jim said, California is at risk for being the first one to hit the wall. But if we are at least the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country and show them what a bad example looks like and how to stay away from it, there might be some value in that too. But if we can turn it faster, it's not a problem. So do your research, get to heritage.org, learn more, and educate your neighbors, as well as holding your local electeds and federal electeds accountable for the behavior that they're unleashing upon us. On that note, I'd like to say have a great night, and we'll see you again either in person or on the show sometime soon. Have a great night.